Welcome to the RTS Series. My name's Todd. I'm the founder of Stutter Studios. I am excited to be able to put this series together. Over the coming weeks and months, we're going to cover a number of core components of any real-time strategy game. This first video will be focused on object selection. Although this video will be focused on unit selection, the principles covered in this video can be used to select other objects such as buildings and resources, just to name a few. Now this can be broken down into a number of components, the first of which is the actual unit being selected. The second is a way to actually highlight that it's been selected, and the third is a place to actually store which units have been selected. So the first thing we actually need is a unit. I'm just going to use a simple sphere, bring it in front of the camera. There we go. Now it's really important that whatever your unit is, that it has a collider, because we'll be using that to actually detect when the player's mouse goes over that actual unit. Now the next thing we will also need is a way to actually show the player that it's been selected or that the mouse is over the actual unit. Now there's a few different ways you could actually do this. You could do this with a world canvas. You could have some kind of line appear around it that gets enabled and also disabled, or you could have an actual line around it, like an outline. Now there's a great free asset on the Unity asset store called Quick Outline, so make sure you actually download that one if you want to follow along with this method. And now that you have downloaded the free Quick Outline asset from the Unity asset store, you can add it by clicking on Add Component and typing Outline. I already had it pre-typed. Now this component has a bunch of different bits of information we can change. So the first one is the actual mode, which determines how that outline is actually rendered. We can change the color. I'm going to make this sort of a greenish blue sort of color. We can change the size of the actual outline. I'll just leave it at the default 2. And we can actually pre-compute this outline. Now this can be beneficial if you've got different game objects that have complex geometry, and they might take a few seconds to actually work out the actual outline. So if you do, perhaps turn that on and then save that as part of your prefab, but if not, and you're just using something simple like this, then you can just leave that turned off. Let's also rename this to unit. Now our unit needs a script, so let's create a script, call it unit, and let's open this up. Okay, so for our unit we actually don't need the update method, so I will get rid of that, but we do need to declare this outline component. So it's of type outline. I'm going to call it outline, but you could really call it whatever you want. So there we've got type outline and it's called outline, and we are going to get a reference to that outline component. So that's really easy. We just type outline equals get component, and it is type outline. Really simple. So at the start, this bit of code will find the component outline, which is sitting here on our unit. Awesome. Now we are going to use the on mouse over the method to actually pick up when the mouse moves over the unit's collider. So this will basically be called every single frame while the mouse is over the collider. You can see that it says it right there, and you might be thinking, well, why aren't we using mouse enter instead? And the reason for that is that if we've got a bunch of units selected and the mouse is hovering over one of them and we deselect those units, then the cursor has already entered that collider, so it then won't do what we actually need it to do in this component. So we will leave it on mouse over, and it's really simple. What we do is we just type outline.enabled equals true, not false. We want to put true here. So when the mouse enters this collider, then we set this to true, and on mouse exit we'll say outline.enabled equals false. So we will turn it on and we will turn it off. Now we also want to ensure that in the start method that we turn it off, because that's the start of the game, and we also want to make sure that this line is after this line, because this gets the reference and then this actually tells it what it wants to do. So back in our scene, we want to make sure that our script is on our unit. It's now been added there. If we go and play, we can now see that we get this cool outline. If I click on it, it does nothing. We haven't added the code for that yet, but we can do stuff like change the size of that line, which is really cool. We can also change the color. Which is awesome. And we can also change these different details at runtime as well. So I'll just stop that. Great. Now back on our unit script, we actually need a way to actually tell the unit that it's been selected. Now the best way to do this, well, not necessarily the best way, but the way that I'm going to do it is with a state. Now it's going to be a really simple state. Either it is selected or it's not. So for that, I'm going to have a boolean called is selected, and let's make it public just so we can see it in action. Cool. So on mouse over, when we click the left mouse button, we want to toggle this to selected, and we only want to do this, which is to disable the outline if the unit's not selected. So that's pretty basic to do. It's not too bad. So we say if input.get mouse button down, or you could do the mouse button up. Just depends. I'm going to go with the left mouse button, which is 0, and then the brackets is selected equals true. And we only want to do this if is selected equals false. Save that. Go back in here, let it compile, play. We've got our boolean there. Cool. Now if I click, you can see it's been selected, but we don't have a way to actually deselect it, so we need to do that now. So we are going to create a separate game object. Let's just reset the transform. It's always a good idea to put it at world 0, and let's just call this selection manager, and this is going to house all of the units that have been selected, or buildings, or whatever you are selecting. We'll create a new script. Let's call it selection manager as well, just so it's easy to follow. Let's actually drag that script over, select it so we can see what's going on. And we will keep the update this time because we want to actually listen for a player right mouse click to actually deselect what's selected, but we need a place to actually store these units. So let's make a public list, and it's of type game object, and we'll call it units selected. Cool. Now we need a way to actually tell this list to actually add this unit to it. So we actually need a publicly accessible method. Let's say add selected to list. That's a public void. Sorry, because we don't want to send anything back. So a public void add selected to list, and we actually want to pass in some kind of just some kind of thing here. Now it's a game object because it's the actual unit that we are interested in, and we'll say object to add, and then we will add it to our list. Object to add, easy, that's great. So we've got our method here, which will add a unit to our list, but we need a way to actually talk to it from here. So we need to declare it. So we need a type selection manager. We'll call it selection manager, and we actually need to find it here. So selection manager. Now we don't want to do get component because this is a different game object, but it's the only selection manager in the game, and there will only ever be one. So we can say find object of type, and then this is the object that's got the selection manager. So that will grab a reference to this object here. So then what we do while we are also selecting the unit is say selection manager and add selected to list, and we need to actually pass in an actual game object. So that's this game object. Now you can type this dot game object, or you can just type game object. And now when I click, see, it gets added. I still don't have a way to actually deselect it, and we've also got a problem that I can add multiple versions of this unit, which we don't want. But that's pretty easy to fix. So we can say if input.get mouse button down is the left mouse button and is selected equals false, then we do this stuff. So that'll only work the first click. So let's just test that out. I'm clicking and it's not adding that unit again. Great. Solve the first problem. Now we also need a way to actually deselect this unit. So we're going to do it over here. So we will use the right mouse button, which is button number 1 in Unity. So the left click is button 0, the right button is button 1, and the middle is 2. And I believe it just goes up from there. So we say if input get mouse button down is the right mouse button, then we want to do something. So what we want to do is we actually want to deselect all selected, or you can call this method whatever you want, but this is the method that'll reach out to our units and deselect them. So we place that in there. So when we press the right mouse button, we call this method. Now what we're going to do is we're going to run through a for each loop, which will look at each object in this list, and then it will call a method on that game object and deselect it. Now we haven't added that method yet, so let's just do that now. And it's got to be a public method because it's got to be called from another class. So we'll call it a public void deselect me, or you could call it deselect unit, or whatever you want. And we want to do a few things here. The first thing is we want to set this to false. So is selected equals false. And the other thing that we want to do is we want to disable the outline. So then we go outline dot enabled equals false. Cool. It's pretty straightforward. So whenever we call this, it'll set the state back to not being selected, and it will also disable the outline. Great. So back on our selection manager class, to do a for each loop, it's pretty easy. We do for each, and then we've got to actually declare the type. So this is type game object, and we can give it a name. It can be called anything that we want, and for the case of this, we will just call it unit, and it is in the units selected list. So again, this is type game object, and we are declaring it as a unit, but we could call this test, we could call this whatever we want, and it's from this units selected list. But what we want to do is we want to get an actual reference to the unit var, which will change to whatever type of like object that sort of just needs to be, and it will change to being a game object. So var unit to access is equal to unit, because this is the unit, the actual game object we are looking at, and we want to get the component unit on that game object. So we are saying for this unit in the list, look for this class, which is this, and then what we can say is unit to access deselect me, and that'll deselect. It'll run this deselect method on that unit. So if there's a single unit, it'll just do it for the one. If there's 5, it'll do it from all 5. Now the last thing that we actually want to do here is we actually want to clear this list, and it's important to do it right at the end. You can't change you can't update a list while you are in a for each loop, because it will just break it. So what we do is we say units selected clear, and that'll clear the list. So let's just make sure we've got everything here. So when we click the right mouse button, we run this bit of code, which will run through this loop and deselect the units. Yep, that's right, and it'll clear the list. Cool. So now, just so it's easier to see, let's just move this up higher. Cool. Okay, so the first thing is, right, that works. We click on that, great. It's selected, and we right click and it deselects it. And it also removes it from the list. We can do it again. Easy. Great. Now what we can do is we can actually add multiples of these. So now we have 4 units. Let's try this again. Awesome. That all works. I can add the different units to the list. I can deselect them all. Also works if I am hovering over one and I deselect. Great. So that concludes this tutorial. The next tutorial will cover more advanced unit selection methods, adding unit ownership, and also setting up the framework for the unit UI.